Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Zuberi, professor at Factor Ummantash Faculty of Social Work in the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and chair of the organizing committee for the 2024 Munk School International Institute on Social Policy's organizing committee. First, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to study and work on this land. Now I would like to introduce Darius Ornston, who is professor and director of academic life at the Munk School, to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Dan. So I would like to start by welcoming everyone here to the International Institute on Social Policy at the Munk School on behalf of our founding director, Janice Stein, and the rest of the leadership team. I am particularly looking forward to this event for a couple of reasons. I think the official reason is that I think that this event exemplifies the strengths and unique features of the Munk School, which is a home for international dialogue, interdisciplinary discussion, and also cross-sectoral collaboration. There's also an unofficial reason, which is that I really love and care deeply about social policy, even though I do really no research on the subject. I'm a scholar of innovation policy and innovation studies, but those of you who know me know that I care deeply about social policy because I think it's substantively important. I study innovation. Innovation is socially and economically disruptive, and I think it is very difficult to do innovation and innovation policy right, especially in rich democracies, if you don't get your social policy right. Social policy is the foundation on which your other economic policies are built. So, regardless of the interests that bring you here tonight, I believe that we pursue those interests best when we do so with a mix of different actors. And so I am pleased to see that we have faculty, students, as well as representatives from the public sector, the private sector, and the civic sector with us tonight. I think that's fantastic. I hope that everyone at this event learns something new, sees social policy in a new way, and gets to meet someone new, preferably someone outside your immediate range of expertise. And I will close off by thanking Dan for taking point on bringing us together as chair of the organizing committee and turning it over to him to welcome our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Darius, for the kind introduction. I'm so pleased and honored to welcome you all here today for this start of the 26th International Institute on Social Policy. This is actually my first institute, but as some context, the event has been held for over 20 years annually at Queen's University until the pandemic. In 2022, it was organized jointly by the Munk School and Queen's University. And now, for the first time, the Munk School alone has organized the event with the generous guidance and advice of Margaret Biggs, Keith Banting, and Naomi Elboim, who were organizers from Queen's University. I'm excited to share that the event also marks the launch of the official launch of the Social Policy Lab at the Munk School that I founded in order to be a hub of social policy scholarship, bringing together interdisciplinary groups of scholars focused on social policy research from across the University of Toronto, Canada, and internationally, with others to learn, engage, and network with those working in social policy from diverse sectors and contributing to the training of the next generation of social policy thinkers, researchers, and leaders through events like this institute, research talks, and more. The theme of this year's meeting is social policy in unsettled times, and they certainly are unsettled. Even from the time we began planning this meeting in spring 2024, the theme, I fear, has become all the more relevant. We await the results of a cliffhanger election in British Columbia, watch the conflicts in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and other parts of the world. And if you're like me, spend lots of time every day reading media stories about the upcoming US election with ever-increasing trepidation. After the COVID-19 pandemic, Canada emerged with lower levels of poverty and inequality, largely due to innovative, if imperfect, social policy safety net responses. But also, like many countries, Canada also experienced a period of high inflation, and growing concern about price of basics like food, housing crisis, toxic drug supply overdose crisis, growing sense of insecurity, rampant homelessness, and devastating extreme weather events linked to climate change. In some countries, some politicians are unfortunately engaging in dog whistle politics, playing on people's fears to demonize and marginalize the most marginalized groups, and proposing simplistic solutions that unfortunately appear to be resonating with parts of the population. Yet, as many in this room know and understand from the research literature, these reforms are unlikely to fundamentally address many of these challenges. The rise of populism globally and reactionary politics is reshaping the social policy landscape as well. At the same time, we have the promise and potential peril of rapidly evolving technologies such as generative AI, which will have a disruptive impact on the labor market, but also may improve outcomes in areas like the healthcare sector, where we see improvements in cancer screening, or potentially more safe roads with self-driving cars, and other potentially almost impossible to understand or imagine improvements in well-being and outcomes. These are unsettled times indeed. Over the next 2 days, we will have the opportunity to learn from some of the leading scholars and rising stars in the field of social policy. I'm so excited we've been able to bring together this incredible program for this year's Institute. We will learn about trends in countries globally, including the US, and understand how Canada and what Canada is experiencing is similar and different. I hope through these presentations and moderated question and answer sessions, we'll get a better sense of the possibilities of social policy in the current geopolitical landscape to reform and improve the social safety net in this country, reduce poverty, inequality, unemployment, and advance well-being, reconciliation, and justice. So before I introduce our esteemed keynote speaker, there are a few people I would like to thank for making this year's Institute possible. First, I'd like to thank Employment and Social Development Canada for a strategic engagement and research program grant to support this year's Institute, as well as the Munk School for its support. In particular, I'd like to thank Munk School Directors of Research, Professor Siri Bresnitz and Sherry Ellie, and Research Officer Sarah Namer, as well as University Professor and Founding Director Janice Stein, and the Munk School Executive Director Ariana Bradford. I would like to thank the Conference Organizing Committee, whose names you'll see on the back of the program, which we'll be distributing tomorrow and is available online, for all of their contributions, with particular appreciation and a debt of gratitude to Professor Carolyn Toohey and Margaret Biggs for their invaluable guidance through all of the planning. I would like to thank ESDC Deputy Minister Paul Thompson and Senior Assistant Deputy Minister Catherine Adam and their staff for their participation. I also would like to thank OEC Director of Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs, Stefano Scarpetta, who flew in from Bogota, Colombia, via Washington, D.C. to be with us here in person and will present first thing in the morning tomorrow before heading back home to Paris. I want to give a huge thank you to the Munk School events team, especially Stacy Bellamere, whose planning brought everyone here to get today and organizing all of the registration, promotion, virtual access to the event, foods, drinks, and snacks we'll be fortunate to enjoy over the next 2 days. It's been a pleasure to work with her and her team. And finally, a big thank you to all of you for joining us today and tomorrow, either in person or virtually. It's so nice to see so many of my favorite colleagues, students, friends, and people I've yet to meet. It's also exciting just to know that there are other people who share such a strong interest in social policy as I do. Okay, so now I'm pleased to introduce our very, very special keynote speaker this evening, Professor Carol Graham from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and the University of Maryland, College Park. As all of the bios for all of our speakers are included in the program, we'll keep our introductions brief during the Institute. So while economics may be have a somewhat well-deserved reputation as a dismal science, we are fortunate, very fortunate today to have Professor Carol Graham travel up from Washington, D.C. today to join us this evening to present her award-winning research on how well-being science can save us from despair. Professor Graham is currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and where she has twice served as vice president, the College Park professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and a Gallup senior scientist. She's a special advisor to the Inter-American Development Bank, a visiting fellow at the World Bank, and consultant to the IMF. Professor Graham has published several books on the study of happiness and well-being, including her most recent book, The Power of Hope, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2023. Please join me in welcoming Professor Graham.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for having me. And I'm sorry if I was late. I literally was in traffic the entire time from customs to all the way here. Anyway, I'm lucky I made it anyway. But I'm happy to be here. Maybe just one word of caution. I'm not an expert on social policy per se, although I've done a lot of work around social policy, and my original work was actually, I'm partly Peruvian, I was born in Peru, and my original work was on safety nets in poor countries and then in countries in market transitions. And by mistake, I fell on some data that, sort of landed me in the, at that time, crazy new world of happiness economics, and a very few crazy people doing it. Economists actually talking to psychologists, much less collaborating with them. We were considered nuts, but it's now gone quite far. In fact, I'll switch. But I mean, one of the things that I never envisioned would happen is not only that it would really become a field in economics where you have a lot of skeptical curmudgeons, that's why they call it the dismal science, but that a lot of governments around the world have started to use the metrics we've developed, not just, in surveys, although having them in the official statistics is critical to countries and governments and local governments starting to use them, but also as tools for cost-benefit analysis in treasuries, in design, monitoring policy, evaluating policy. The UK has really led the charge, but New Zealand's done a lot. There's some talk of it in Canada. I don't think you all have fully gotten there yet, but there's a lot of progress. And some other countries around the world. The US, of course, is a laggard, and we are so mired right now in our unsettled times. That I was kind of happy to leave for a day. The election period is really been a little bit on the terrifying side, but let's be hopeful. Anyway, so just a word about kind of how we got here, and then why I think hope is so important, why I've focused on hope. I mean, the real reason I've focused on hope is I've done so much work recently, in the past decade, on deaths of despair in the United States. I had to have another outlook, but they're analogs of each other. But anyway, so we started this approach precisely because the metrics, or what we first found in surveys, and then developed more robust metrics, were telling us things that income-based measures were not, right? And it's not that one measure is better than the other, and I'm not advocating replacing GNP or GDP. I think that's nuts, and I don't think it does the field any good, because the people that run around and say throw out GDP end up, then a lot of serious economists and policymakers, at least in the U.S., would not listen to us. But when you see differences between what income-based measures and survey measures tell you, there's something going on, right? You can have great economic indicators and people are saying it's terrible, like in the U.S. today. But the other thing is they also answer the kinds of questions that revealed preferences-based approaches can't answer. So I'm sure you all know, but particularly in economics, there's a very strong tradition of not using survey data, because the assumption was, or the assertion was, that you can't believe what people say. You can only believe what people do, and that has to have some kind of budget trade-off, right? And so it's a consumption choice. We all know there are consumption choices that are absolutely nuts, that people are irrational. They buy things and they don't want them, they regret them, and lots of other things. So that, but the main, I think, where it's really useful asking people in surveys is when our metrics just don't tell us things like the effects of environmental damage on people. I mean, you can have a cost estimate of how many houses got destroyed during the last 2 hurricanes in Florida, and that's a cost, but you have no idea what the deeper psychological costs are. And then there are also situations, particularly in very poor places, or where there's a lot of discrimination, whether it's gender discrimination or discrimination against LGBTQs or whatever it might be, that people don't really have the agency to make choices because of very strongly imposed norms. And so, but we can tell if their situation is making them unhappy, stressed, angry, through our survey data in a way that you can't do through other approaches. And then the other one is when you think about choices that are not rational, I'm much less concerned about people consuming things that are stupid. I mean, you buy a car that's very expensive and then you regret it, I'm not going to feel sorry for you. But there are a lot of people that make choices because of addiction or self-control problems, and they make choices that are really bad for their health, for their longevity. And again, that's how these metrics actually can track some of this, and I'll explain in the next couple slides how we do that. Just quickly, we have 3 key dimensions of well-being. And we try not to use the term happiness. I know it's in a lot of the books I've written because it sells books, but the problem with happiness is a term for research or policy. It can be happiness today, which is a contentment measure, or it can be happy with your life as a whole, which is more of a cognitive evaluation. So we use the term life satisfaction if we can, and at least we can't always design what's in the surveys if we aren't designing them, but in general, that's best practice. And we call that evaluative well-being because it's a cognitive assessment of your life as a whole. So young people think about what their life will be like, the opportunities we'll have. Old people look back on their life as a whole. It's not a momentary measure. We also do measure momentary measures. We call it hedonic well-being, and that's sort of mood or affect during daily activities, smiling, stressed, angry. And Danny Kahneman, who we worked with very closely early on, the first psychologist to get the Nobel Prize in economics. That got the skeptical economists, by the way. But anyway, he really developed most of these measures and how you could use them. And I can tell you some funny stories about things he found, but I don't want to take too long up front because I know it's late and I'm not exactly sure. I get mired in something and then go off. But anyway, and then eudaimonic well-being is a more recent measure, and we started to actually use it. It's in the British National Statistics, and its purpose and meaning in life. And the reason it's so important is that when you think about people in despair, that's actually what they've lost. And I'll go into more detail on that. So why hope? Why propose another metric? One, these survey questions take about 30 seconds each to answer, so they really don't add much time to a survey. They're very inexpensive to collect. And I've become much more interested in hope because it turns out it's the dimension of well-being that is most closely linked to long-term outcomes, to longevity, to performance in the labor market, to investments in your future, human capital investments when you're young, to aging better, living longer when you're old, to having better relationships. Life satisfaction and hope track pretty closely, but hope is more distinctly has an agentic side to it, right? Hope is not the belief that everything will get better. It's a belief that you can make it better, right? And then the other thing is the opposite of hope is despair. And at least in the US, the high cost of widespread despair is unfathomable. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And already both the UK and the OECD have added hope to their battery of well-being metrics in their national statistics or in the OECD guidelines. I might have had something to do with that, but I'm not going to overclaim. And then, okay, so then while there's just another kind of reason to use different metrics is that it turns out that our unequal distributions of well-being in countries like the US, I think Canada does better than we do, but there are a lot of countries where well-being is very unequally distributed in addition to income. Well-being is just a more inclusive measure. Actually are a barrier to social progress, to social policy working, to all sorts of things. And in contrast, hope for the future, as I mentioned, is really strongly associated with better long-term outcomes. And despair is associated with premature death. So that's sort of a brief intro. Very quickly, and I know nobody wants to see an equation at almost 8 at night, but I will dash through it quickly, and you don't really have to remember the equation. But the idea is that we're not asking people what makes you happy, or does this make you happy or unhappy, or does this make you stressed? what we're doing is we do standard econometric equations where you have the well-being. It can be any dimension. It can be life satisfaction. It can be hope. It could be anger. It can be stress of individual I at time t. And then on the right side of the equation is, a constant, and then a vector of the beta is a vector of socioeconomic and demographic traits, and then an epsilon. And most economists tend to throw out the epsilon in their work because it's noise in the data. Well, it turns out in well-being equations, we can explain about 40, maybe 50% of individual well-being by what we can observe, by these other things that we're controlling for and other factors. So about half of it is what we call unexplained, and it's usually due to innate character traits. So like IQ, right, which is determined both by genes and the environment, well-being is a bit like that. There are natural distributions of character traits, pretty bell-shaped, and on the extremes you have the curmudgeons on one side, the people that will just always be curmudgeonly no matter what. And it turns out they need more money to make them happy than happier people. And then on the other extreme are sort of the happiest people who are very creative. They don't need much money to make them happy, and so they don't care much about. No, I said that all right. But anyway, so you have to sort of think of these things interacting. So people's innate character traits and their environment, and so the environment does matter. It's like IQ, right? You can be born with high levels of IQ, and if you have a really horrible growing up, eventually it doesn't develop the way it should. The same goes, you can be born with a kind of naturally cheerful, happy character traits, and yet if you get enough knocks, then what? And I'm going to talk about the implications of that for hope at the end. Anyway, so then what we get is, and I did the first large-scale study of the determinants of well-being in developing countries, because it was all the survey data we had was for rich countries. And it was assumed that rich industrialized countries were very different from developed countries. I'm from Peru. I didn't think it was that way, really. But it turns out they're incredibly consistent across people everywhere. So income does matter. This sort of income doesn't matter. If you're destitute, you can't make choices in life. You can't say you have a good life and you're satisfied with it if you had no role in your destiny, or you are unlikely to feel that way. Age matters. I'll show you that in a second. Health matters more than income. Full employment matters for people that want to be employed. It's actually unemployment, or long-term unemployment, is one of the worst things for people's well-being. So it's for people that want to be in the labor force and can't, become unemployed and can't get back in. And they lose the narrative of their lives. They tend to, and it's worse for men than for women, but it has long-term scarring effects. So what we find is that there are a lot of things that people can adapt to and return to their previous levels of well-being if they have a negative shock. Long-term unemployment is definitely not one. And then social relationships matter a lot. And one thing about marriage, I'll put marriage up there. Marriage is just one formalization of a social relationship, obviously. But the problem with it is it's often interpreted that getting married is what makes you happy. But that's really an artifact of construction in the data. So if you're looking at large surveys that are cross-sections, right, it turns out that people that marry each other are happier, and people who are less happy don't get married. So when you are looking at comparing the happiness or other dimensions of well-being of a married person compared to a non-married person, all you're comparing is the fact that the person that was marrying or finding married was happier to begin with. And we have a couple studies on the long-term effects of being married. I have a wonderful colleague in Paris, Claudia Senek, who's written a great article called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife." And it turns out, first of all, the benefits, the happiness benefits of getting married last about 18 months, and then people return to their normal levels. Hate to break it to you guys. But anyway, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just don't expect too much on the happiness front. But the probability of divorce is highest when you have a happy person married to an unhappy person, when there are asymmetries in happiness. So it's better to have two happy people or two miserable people. But a happy person and an unhappy person drive each other crazy. Anyway, so the reason those consistent patterns matter is because we then can include them always as control variables, and then we can look at things that vary or change more, like inflation or the unemployment rate or inequality or environmental quality, commuting time, smoking or exercise, as things that vary more, having controlled for all these other things. And again, forget the equation, just remember, we're not asking people if certain things make them happy, right? They don't really, they don't relate the question we ask about their life satisfaction, say in the beginning, to all these other things we are looking at. So age. This slide makes you happy or unhappy depending where you are on the U curve. So this is the famous midlife crisis. It's not a crisis, it's a midlife dip in well-being, and there's a midlife hump in stress and anxiety and reported depression as well, and some other biological markers. So it seems to happen. It doesn't, maybe not everybody, but on average to almost everybody. And we found it holds in 142 or so countries of the 160 countries in the Gallup World Poll. So the only places it doesn't hold is places that are really poor or very violent or both. And aging there is really difficult. But otherwise, after you get past this mid-low, which can be earlier or later, like in Costa Rica, which is a very happy country, they get out of the U by 45. Versus in Russia, they get out of the U around age 60, which is roughly the living life expectancy of men. You can draw your conclusions about what's happening. But then after that, people actually get older, happier as they get older, till they're about, here, this is this data is from Latin America. After 80, 85, you start to have pretty serious health problems get in the way. This U is controlled for age-adjusted health, so that we don't assume that a 75-year-old's health is the same as an 18-year-old's, but we can't, if really bad health is a problem for the. Now, the one actually really scary thing, and at least for the data I've seen for Canada, you have a bit of this, but not as much. In the U.S., the U shape isn't there anymore. It's a linear line straight up. So our youth are significantly less happy than our old, and they're even less happy than the middle-aged. So we have a crisis of youth unhappiness and mental health problems. I'm thinking the last World Happiness Report, which is where a bunch of countries were listed. European countries didn't have that trend for the most part, nor did Latin Americans. Some countries did, some countries didn't, and certainly Australia and I think Canada did. But again, there are levels, or different levels of it. Okay, so one of the things I've been looking at, or got me into hope as much as happiness, I was already looking at happiness and unhappiness, but deaths of despair, it's a genuine crisis in the U.S., but what we found is that the metrics we've developed, like lack of hope, stress, worry, lack of meaning and purpose, are closely linked to populations and places that have high levels of deaths of despair. And when we've been able to look at over time data, we actually find that the despair usually precedes the increase in deaths. So had we been tracking these things regularly, again, it's very cheap to track the metrics. It's a lot harder to reverse death. It's just, a fact. Or even addiction crisis and all the other things that are associated with deaths of despair and the health costs that relate. We could have had some warning indicators of what was going on. Instead, Ann Case and Angus Deaton released a paper showing there was this crisis of midlife mortality among working class whites. And I was looking at the U.S. at the same time, comparing hope levels to the U.S. and Latin America, and I was amazed that the differences between the poor and the rich about in terms of who has hope were huge in the U.S., 20 times greater than Latin America, which is an unequal region, but people are more hopeful there. And the poor are still hopeful they can get ahead. And that's not the case in the U.S. right now. So it's definitely, the metrics have, lots of uses, but this is, I think, a pretty critical one. And then what we find is that despair is also linked to other poor markers of objective health and high levels of reported pain, opioid addiction, and obviously the deaths. But also we find that the worst off group in the U.S., which goes to the long-term unemployment point, are the out-of-labor force, white out-of-labor force men. So they have lost, there are a lot of them because of the decline of manufacturing, the decline of the blue-collar jobs, and the role that or the effects of innovation, which have been amazing, but, obviously unequally distributed. And who knows what's going to happen with AI, but it's, obviously it's on the horizon. So that's definitely, it's another kind of reason these things matter. And then we find big racial differences in all of these findings, which I'll go to next. But as I mentioned before, just focusing on the U.S. because it's the one I know the most about, the youth mental health crisis, not only have we been seeing since 2011 increases in despair, anxiety, and suicide, but we've also seen that in the latest World Happiness Report, our youth ranks 62nd in the world, right? The U.S. is not great. It ranks 17th. It should be in the top 10 just because of its income levels, but everything else is not so good, like its social policy. But, the youth, it was pretty stark finding from my perspective. So what do we know about hope? How do we know that hope makes a difference? And so I've been doing surveys of low-income young adults, and those with higher levels of hope are much more likely to aspire to and achieve, because we have overtime data on some of them, higher education, and to avoid risky behaviors that jeopardize their health. So if you have hope for your future, you're less likely to do things that are going to jeopardize your health. It's kind of intuitive, but it's not documented very well or very often. And then, interestingly enough, I did some of these surveys in Missouri, which is a state that has every problem the U.S. has, all mixed in. It's also bordered by 7 other states or 8 states. It's right smack in the middle of all sorts of stuff, including political polarization. But anyway, it turns out that the white kids I interviewed were much less hopeful for the future, much less likely to want to go to college. I interviewed just high school graduates mainly, because I needed them to be over 18, but I didn't want them to be too old. And it was blacks and other minorities that were much more determined to go to college and had a mentor that supported their aspirations. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Cost was an issue. COVID was an issue. But the white kids literally said their parents had no interest in them going to college. And part of it is the tradition of blue-collar whites of just graduating public high school and getting a good, stable job. That's just not an option anymore. Part of it is some ideological, unfortunately, another issue that's polarized, right? College education is an elite plot, to teach you wokeness or something. Anyway, so that also cycled in. But the findings were very stark and very consistent. And, for the white kids, it's just going to contribute to a vicious generational cycle. Are we going to have another generation of low-income whites in despair? We'll have 25 Donald Trumps. I'll be living in Peru, by the way, so don't worry. Anyway, and it was the black respondents that were also more likely than the white kids in Missouri to go to college, conditional on graduating high school. So turns a lot of things you think about on their head. And I think trying to, understanding these dynamics is pretty, if you look at, for example, the U.S. now, there's just so many weird things going on and so much skepticism about civic institutions, about, higher education, about the media, about all kinds of things. And you kind of need to understand the emotions that underlie those things, because you have lots of facts about the trends, but not always what drives them. And on youth mental health, which I'll talk about also, I should probably speed up, but everybody blames social media because TikTok and the decline in U.S. mental health started in about 2012. Very clear timing. And I have no doubt social media exacerbated all this. Or then that people blame COVID, and I have no doubt COVID exacerbated it. But the underlying causes are much deeper. And I will try and highlight some of what I think might be going on. But just quickly to the racial differences. I found these numbers are from about 2015 when I was finding this. These are the optimism findings I was talking about, but this was only U.S. racial groups. And finding that low-income blacks, these are all low-income groups, were 3 times as likely to be 1 point higher on the optimism scale than low-income whites. And first I thought I'd coded the data wrong. It was the time of the Ferguson riots in Missouri, the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore, a lot of unhappiness and unrest in the African-American community. I wasn't surprised that Hispanics were optimistic just because it seemed to be almost a cultural trait. But, and then Ann and Angus came out with their study about deaths of despair that was all, less than college-educated whites. And that's when I started thinking, we should be matching these trends so we can understand what's going on. And it turns out, just really quickly, that holding has held through the Trump presidency, through COVID, when low-income African Americans were the hardest hit by COVID. It still holds today. So this is not like determined just by some environmental thing. Lots of reasons for it, which I'm happy to answer the questions. And a little bit the same for Hispanics. So unfortunately, this is out of date, or it has changed a lot, but this was the original Case and Deaton work on deaths of despair. And what is striking is that red line going up. So that's life expectancy, it's all-cause mortality for people aged 45 to 54 in several rich countries, France, Germany, UK, Canada, Austria, Sweden, and then also U.S. Hispanics are the blue line in the middle. And if African Americans were on there, which it's their chart, they would be kind of going down with Hispanics. The red line going up, where mortality rates are going up, is U.S. whites. Now, that is, by 2015, these trends were big enough to drive to overall increases in our American life expectancy, and they haven't stopped. The complication since about 2018, and something I'm starting to try and get better data for now, because the CDC is also quite slow updating their mortality data and everything else, but we're pretty positioned to do this. All of a sudden, African-American men are now very highly represented in new overdose deaths, primarily also Native American men, and also the young. So now it's not just middle age, it's a lot more young people. So it's kind of, just really quickly, there are also, despair is also contagious. There's a place-based component to it. You can have entire communities in despair. I have a really good friend, colleague, Ken Thompson, who was at SAMHSA, the U.S. Agency for Suicide and Drug Abuse. And he's originally from Pittsburgh, UPitt, and he's working in all the declined manufacturing places around. And he says you go to communities and everybody's in despair. It's kind of, it gets to be contagious. If all your neighbors are overdosed or and committed suicide and there are no jobs, Anyway, so what you see is now this is just mortality rates for whites in the U.S., and the darkest red places are where the mortality rates are highest. And if you were to impose on this a map of reported pain or of reliance on disability insurance or primage men out of the labor force or Trump voting, you would get very similar patterns. And there's a lot of good work that shows Trump voting in 2016 had a lot to do with hope going down in communities in the 10 years before. So despair has a lot of implications that are not so great. And another one is vulnerability to misinformation. So if you live in one of these declining communities and you don't have any hope, you also have lost local media, you've lost jobs, good education opportunities, and you've lost the narrative of your own life. You know, people are very vulnerable to misinformation, right? Any narrative is better than the narrative they have, right? And unfortunately, most of the swing goes to right-wing radicalization. We have built an interactive, and that's a link to it, that's between places in despair and misinformation and the structural things in those places, like lack of local news, lack of education opportunities, something called advanced cognitive skill deserts, where people graduate high school and they still don't have adequate numeracy and literacy rates, and other things, and then how that interacts with despair and vulnerability to misinformation. And I think, as we see it now in the U.S., misinformation is a huge factor in our elections. So anyway, if you are interested in it, that's the link to the interactive. And you can play around with it. You can click on a county in a state and kind of see what the trends are. And then the most recent, as I mentioned, change to deaths of despair in the U.S. is huge rise in overdose deaths. So overdose deaths increased 2,000 and some percent between 1990 and 2020 in the U.S. That isn't just addiction. There's something else, right? It does relate to addiction, obviously, but people that are kind of fine with their lives rarely all of a sudden get so severely addicted. They are looking for a batch of fentanyl that's so lethal that the people who have taken it died, so you can get a good high and hope you don't die. You know, there's something else going on there. But anyway, after COVID, we had 100,000 OD deaths per year in both 2021 and 22, and then a very modest decline in 2023, in part due to better control of fentanyl supply chains, but we still don't fully know. But the other thing I've found out is that the deaths are still very high, and now they aren't always due to fentanyl. There's some polysubstance use, because people substitute in other drugs when they can't get fentanyl. And there's also a social contagion effect, which is terrifying. One of my PhD students has been looking at Reddit data, and there are fentanyl chat groups, and they're talking about the batches and what's better, and it's, you know, so it's not just despair is contagious, but there's sort of a social contagion effect of all of this. And so a recent article in The Lancet estimated that 3.1 million years of life were lost to premature overdose deaths in 2022 alone in the U.S. So that's people dying prematurely. That's how they measure it. Interesting enough, the suicide rate has been pretty flat. But the problem with overdose deaths is unless there's a note, you don't know if it was intentional. And a lot of overdose deaths are actually intentional, or at least people don't care, right? I mean, that's a fine line. So the estimate about what's intentional goes between 15 and 60%, which is kind of useless, right? I mean, we don't know, but we know that some of these overdose deaths were just simple substitutes for suicide. And then, you know, one of the deep roots of all of this, I think, particularly for the young, which is why I think now we're really seeing our youth very anxious and depressed and whatever, is that they're already facing changing labor markets, right? You with a public high school education and $1, maybe you can buy a Coke if it's cheap, not cocaine, just like, it's just, there aren't jobs for just high school graduates. There's a huge difference in life expectancy between people with and without BAs in the United States. Now we have AI, kind of banging on the door. It's got potential, it's got promise, it's got, it's threatening for some particular groups that aren't prepared for it or can't, are not trained for managing it. And then you're also seeing higher education in the U.S. getting so expensive, and I'm not sure I don't know if you've had a similar trend, but we are at a point where higher education is out of reach for many, unless you can get a full scholarship, or you're from a very wealthy family, or you're willing to be in have student loans for a long time. And then we also have political polarization and disinformation just running rampant. And when I think about it, if this particular election in the U.S. was the first election you voted in as a young person, who wouldn't be just desperate and anxious, right? It doesn't make sense. It's crazy. But so I think all of this is taking a toll as, young people think about their futures, and they're also really worried about climate change much more than older people. And then again, you have the decline of civic organizations and participation, and all of that is going together into kind of a mess that's hard to disentangle. But I think a lot of it has to do with the underlying roots of despair. And so what I take away from it is not that we can understand everything that interacts and how it does, although it would be nice to, but that we do have to address the demand side. So it's not just restricting the supply of drugs that's going to solve the problems, right? The demand side is despair. So now to a much more upbeat topic, since I've just talked about death and overdose for 10 minutes. Can we restore hope? I mean, that's a big question. Can you restore hope in places where it's gone, right? Where people, where despair has become contagious? So my recent research finds that hope is the well-being dimensions that's most linked to future behavior. And yet, how do we make people, people have to be able to make their own situation better. How do we do that, right? Part of it is just changing emotions and aspirations, which is easier to do than changing structural constraints. But the opposite of hope is despair, as I mentioned, and that's most associated with despair and related deaths. And I think what we're seeing in the U.S. is that our crisis of despair is now not only affecting health and longevity, but it's affecting our civil society and electoral process and all kinds of stuff. And we don't really know that much. Psychiatrists, for example, admit hope is understudied, but they also note that restoring hope is a critical element or first step in recovering from mental illness, as it restores the agency that people need to recover, right? And so what do we know about hope? We do know that hope is in part heritable, like other traits, but it also can be developed and learned. And Jim Heckman and Tim Kautz have found, they have a very cool 2012 article on socio-emotional skills. And so they include the big 5 personality traits, but also traits like hope. And there is empirical evidence that people can develop these skills much later in life than IQ or cognitive skills. So, in other words, you can be in your middle age and kind of, through a number of things, become more hopeful. And then I'll talk a bit about what we know about things that can do that. But it's helpful to know. And one thing we know, even with the U-curve in life satisfaction, one of the things psychiatrists attribute it to is that older people may not improve their IQ anymore. There's a point, like past age 30, you don't change your IQ that much. But they can improve their emotional wisdom. That older people just get emotionally more wise because they've been through a lot. For young people, a negative shock is like the end of the world. once you get older, you've had so many negative shocks, they roll off your back unless they're really bad. But no, it's true. It's kind of, you have a very different perspective, right? Anyway, so back to these surveys of low-income adolescents, just to give you a little bit more detail. I started in Peru just because I do a lot of research there and doing field research. I have a team that I can work with. And we interviewed 400 kids when they were 17 and then again when they were about 21. And we had a whole battery of questions about hope and self-esteem and social relationships and all kinds of stuff, and education aspirations. And we found, first of all, an incredible amount of percent of our respondents, 85% of our respondents in a low-income, large peri-urban neighborhood in Peru, not one of whose parent was a college graduate or had even gone to college. 85% of them said they were going to go to college or grad school, evenly split. And their parents were all, they owned little markets, they were informal taxi drivers, they were construction workers, they were domestic servants, but they wanted their kids to do better than them. And when we went back about 3.5 years later, all of the high hope kids were still in school. And we also found that hope was persistent within people over time, that there is a certain persistence level. We don't really know how much it takes to, for people to stop being hopeful, but at least we found, despite negative shocks and other things that a lot of these low-income kids had, they were still at it, and they were still in the process of completing their education. And then, what we got in Missouri with a similar survey adapted for U.S. content was this juxtaposition of African American and other minorities' optimism and high aspirations for college, and low-income whites not even wanting to consider it. And, so it's hard to figure out what to do there, but we need to know and understand the patterns first. And unfortunately, I also don't think, at least in the United States, we do have some tangible lessons from what makes African and Latin American communities more resilient, have better peer support, have social networks, informal safety nets. But I can't see low-income whites in Missouri wanting to learn from those efforts. Unfortunately, we're just too polarized a country, but there are ways to think about it otherwise. So, again, what do we do about it? There are a lot of examples in my book. I can't go into everything tonight, or you will all be very tired and sleepy. But the idea is, for the young, we need, among other things they really need, is mentorship, right? Because navigating the world they're looking at is very difficult, and they need somebody, like if the low-income white kids had a mentor who said, you're not going to get a job. You may be very reliant, but with a public high school education and nothing else, you're not going to get a job. You don't have to go to college, but you need vocational training or something, and the skills that are necessary in tomorrow's labor markets, creativity, adaptability, a whole bunch of other kind of softer skills, which is a bad word in some circles, but, are actually what make you make it in the labor market today. Unless you're a brilliant rocket scientist, but that's not going to be the average. Anyway, and then for old people that are isolated and in despair, one very easy step is to get them back out into their communities. Volunteering, walks with friends, participation in the arts. And the UK has a huge number of examples of this that are very well documented. Some are actually created by academics and implemented by academics and then evaluated for generalizability, scalability by other academics. So there's a whole process. And guess what? They work. They have a campaign to end loneliness in the UK that's been really successful, just with this kind of very simple intervention. Because when people get in despair, they just, they kind of shut down, and they don't, and the minute, you get them out, it's not like some immediate magic bullet, but it's really helpful. So I'm going to end with a quote from Amanda Gorman in her the poem she read at Biden's election, and it's hope is not a promise we give, it's a promise we live, right? And that's what makes hope different from optimism. In my book, I compare the tragic optimist versus the hopeful pessimist. The tragic optimist is the one that just thinks it will get better. And for some very poor people in very bad conditions, that's a psychological survival mechanism. I'm not being critical of it, but it's often not going to lead to change, versus hope the definition of hope, which a psychologist called Dan Schneider wrote about in the 1950s, was having aspirations, agency, and pathways. And it's pathways where it gets complicated, because here's kind of we know there's some potential for community-based interventions to restoring hope, but do we know the direction of causality, in the sense that you can't just, if you fix structural constraints, if you fix constraints to, that block pathways, which is part of the story, people won't respond if they're in despair. I have an article and some research on prime-age males out of the labor force in the U.S. And I would say you could build a moving to opportunity, office outside their front door, and they would not go in, right? They're not going to, because they're in despair. So you can't just fix structural constraints if there's no hope. But yet, how long can hope last if the structural constraints are, if they never go away? And so that's when I said the question earlier. We don't know how long it takes before if people finally lose hope. And I don't have a number saying that this percent of people in despair in the U.S. have lost hope forever. I think some of them have, that we know. But so that is a real question that I think we have to contend with. But I think trying to understand the kind of emotional and related traits that underpin human behavior and responses to incentives is really important if we're going to resolve any problems like this. So thank you for listening, and I hope I didn't go on too long.
Thank you so much for your inspiring talk. I'm now happy to open the floor for questions from the audience. So virtual, we have about 100 people registered to participate virtually as well, and they're welcome to add their questions to the chat. And Fabio here will ask a few of those questions during this discussion.
Do you want me to sit next to you?
It's your choice if you'd rather sit down. You've had a long trip, a long day. So if you are selected to ask a question, I'd ask you, we'll bring you a wireless microphone so that the people who are listening virtually can hear your question clearly. Once you have the microphone, please identify yourself and affiliation before asking your question. And given the size of the crowd, I'd appreciate it if you could try to limit yourself to one question. So I'll go ahead and open up the floor. Go ahead. So.
Thank you. It was really interesting. I was wondering where you're taking this research and how you're pushing forward what types of policies in the U.S. or other places with it.
What's your name? Sorry.
Oh, my name's Emily Baird.
Well, thank you. It is a good question. I'm doing a couple of different things. One is trying to, very boring, but needs to be done. Well, I don't think it's boring. I'm a nerd, but is trying to understand what's going on with mortality rates, where and how they match to changes in well-being in the people who are newly represented in deaths of despair, namely the young and minorities, because that really is a big departure from everything we found before 2018. So it's a puzzle, and nobody seems to have an explanation, and I'm just trying to see if we can shed some insights by also looking at patterns in well-being that accompany the death increases. And then I'm also trying to do some stuff that focuses specifically on the young, because I think that's a lot, you can imagine somebody who's old and, not facing a long lifespan might have hope for their grandchildren or something, but, it's kind of natural to sort of say, well, I'm not that hopeful for my future, but for young people who are just starting their lives have no hope, it's a pretty depressing thought. And then the thing I'm really doing directly to policy with, in conjunction with a colleague at the Harvard School of Public Health, and hopefully with support from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, is make a concerted effort to get decent well-being statistics into the U.S. statistical system. So what we have now is, because of COVID, they started going, oh no, we have to worry about well-being, even though when we proposed it in 2012, I was on the National Academy of Sciences panel that proposed, how we could include the metrics in our statistics and use the metrics in policy, and everybody laughed at us. The UK went ahead, and they've done a ton in that area and been, followed by other countries. But what happened since COVID is people went, wait a minute, the statistics agencies, we need to measure, these negative well-being patterns, and they all started to measure reported depression and anxiety different ways, so you couldn't compare across statistics. And they didn't also include the positive statistics. And I get requests for comments from almost every official agency as they were starting to include new questions. And I said, you really need to include the positive metrics. So because, you need to know if people who are reporting increased anxiety during a pandemic, go figure, right, have, had a baseline of pretty decent levels of well-being, or if they were already very low well-being, and in which case you'd be a lot more worried, right? And just as it's also, you want to track the positive and negative metrics separately because they tell us different things. Like in Europe, life satisfaction didn't fall much at the same time that depression and anxiety increased. So that, again, that reflects a very different trend than if everything is, the bad things are going up, the good things are going down. So we're hosting like or starting some working groups with people in the statistics agency, particularly CDC because it's the most consequential, but also NIH and some others, to try and see if we can make some headway in having just a better, we don't even have good trends. And the reason there's so much dispute over what caused the youth mental health crisis is we still don't even know. There's not even agreement on when it started, right? Much less why. So other than saying it's social media, which I'm sure made it worse, but so that's, and then, in a way, getting the metrics in our statistics is a first step towards being able to use them in policy in a credible way. Like in the UK, they had a champion in the government, which is often what you need, who was Gus O'Donnell, who was chair of cabinet under Blair, Brown, and Cameron. Amazing civil servant who also happens to be a brilliant econometrician, but he's a brilliant politician. And, the first year they put the metrics into the annual population survey in Britain, people didn't know what the hell was going on. I mean, the total so it took them like 2-3 years to understand, and now they release the metrics twice a year. People want to know, how their age cohort or their racial cohort or their district or their region is doing, and it's become natural and they understand the scales. So like, the unemployment rate, most people don't really know how it's calculated. No idea, but they know that a 1% increase is bad, and they know that a 0.1% increase is, same with the stock market, right? The Dow Jones falls so much, you panic. It doesn't, it falls a little bit, you don't pay much attention. So the scales on well-being metrics are the same. People just need to know what they mean. So like a 1-point increase on an 11-point scale, which is what we use, in national average life satisfaction, say, is a huge increase. But people wouldn't know that the first time they see a 1%, 1-point increase, which would be roughly a 10% increase. But we're so far from that we can't really talk about making policy based on these metrics still. They're part of our stats. I mean, I love Gallup surveys, but you can't expect, surveys that aren't fully publicly available to take on national importance in policy. Anyway, so that's kind of a long, detailed answer. But.
Go ahead.
I thought I turned my ringer off. But
Thanks. Is this working? Could hope be a function of relative income than absolute income? For example, the low-income blacks were more hopeful because compared to other blacks, they were not as poor, whereas the low-income whites were less hopeful because compared to other whites, they were really poor.
there is certainly an element of that, because if you look at data in the U.S. on life expectancy until 2018, and after that, everything's a bit of a mess. But data on things like marriage rates, education rates, life expectancy for blacks and Hispanics, it's been gradually going up, right? Which also translates into better lives, better jobs, all kinds of stuff. Not quickly, but gradually up. And when you see the decline in the whites, premature or life expectancy, it's also because they've had a relative, not just to other whites who are very wealthy, right? But minorities used to always be behind them, and they're falling behind minorities on a number of statistics, and that may be as big a part of it, because unfortunately that has to do with racial discrimination, all kinds of things, which is why I think Trump's kind of vitriolic message has resonated in ways that most of us just can't believe and don't want to. But I think it's there, and I think in part that's because of feeling that these groups that you were at least ahead of them are now getting ahead of you.
Yeah, I agree. It's very depressing. Go ahead.
So this is a question from a political scientist to an economist. I'll just preface it that way, but I'd like to take you to your final point about the importance of community-level interventions, which I would think require community-level leadership. And I wonder if you've thought about how that maps onto the sort of jurisdictional structures that most nations have, which concentrate the resources for social policy at levels of government that are more expansive across geography, and whether there's a fundamental mismatch between where the resources are and where you really need the leadership to pick up and move forward. And I wonder if that in turn suggests the importance of engaging civil society, which is less, if you will, hierarchical in its organization and potentially more vibrant at the community level, and whether there are social policy levers that would allow the resources, the levels of government, the orders of government in which the resources are concentrated to actually support leadership in civil society at the community level.
Wow, so there's a lot in that question. Let me just start with the resource issue. And in the U.S., actually, resources for social policy are very much determined at the state level. And so guess which states are awful, right? And reduce TANF, which is cash assistance to needy people, or make getting health insurance most difficult, all this stuff. And then also have often very concentrated resources in terms of local government and the extractive industries. So there's a brilliant book by Luke Schaefer, who's an economist at University of Michigan, and Catherine, why am I blanking on her
Eden.
name? Eden, Kathy Eden.
And Luke's
who's
coming
a-
tomorrow.
Oh, really? Oh,
Presenting,
Luke is
yes.
great. Tell him I said hi. Yeah, Kathy Eden, and it's called The Injustice of Place, and they show how local governments corrupt local elites and extractive industries, whether it was, could have begun as slave plantations, slave-based plantations, to, oil industries or coal mines or whatever. And in the poorest parts of the U.S., it was local governments and the kind of elites, the rich elites, actually, they kind of hoarded all the resources, and the outcome's been pretty dramatic. So in our case, we could use more centralized resources, but that's sort of separate from the community level question. I mean, I can see in other countries and places where the safety net is really designed at the central level, and it's not clear it's always responsive to community level needs, but it's probably better than, the sort of where we, there's got to be a happy medium. But on civil society, I completely agree with you, and it's a big part of a lot of these solutions. And the problem is there is no central lever for supporting these organizations. But there's just there are an amazing number of bottom-up efforts. One is a wonderful initiative called the Visible Hands Collaborative, which is run by Ken Thompson, the psychiatrist I talked for. And he based it on his experience seeing an initiative in Brazil that included peer supports and community leaders in getting better mental health care to the community, but also in supporting people to get it and ask for it. And the idea being that, the doctor-patient model for psychiatry that's been there for a long time is just not going to meet the demand of today, nor is it in a lot of poor rural communities in the U.S. there is no mental health care. So even if you could deliver, one doctor to a community, what are they going to do? Walk in and know who needs help. So they need to collaborate with the community. So I think, and there's some of that going on too in the positive well-being space, things to like try and reduce loneliness or support kids with mentorship or whatever. So there are little efforts bubbling up, but there's no central kind of source. And I don't think it has to be a lot of resources, but even like to coordinate and share information in like a clearinghouse, a federal level clearinghouse, so that when communities decide they want to start an initiative like this, every community doesn't just start over. They have examples of models that have worked, that have not worked, but they also have examples of different approaches, and they can kind of sort of decide which one they're going to do with some sort of sense of how it worked before. That's going to work a lot better than starting from scratch.
Great. Fabio, do you have a question for online? No? Okay. So we'll go to Andrew and then Musa. Last question.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. So my question is, I think, about interventions that can move people from despair to hope. So as I was listening, I was struck by the connection to work around education and education savings. So people would know for low-income families where parents haven't gone to university, there's a correlation between having an education savings account and the child's education achievement eventually. When that's opt-in, it's easy to explain because parents who are more hopeful are going to take the steps. But the correlation is there when it's automatically provided or not opt-in, or something that every family receives if they're below a certain income threshold. And that's observed but harder to explain, especially because it's not related to the amount of savings. It's not an affordability issue. It's the presence of the account that makes a difference. In Canada,
It's kind of like earmarked funds, right?
Yeah,
So the
earmarked
parents-
funds, yeah.
Because I have a PhD student that's doing some very cool work on the child tax credit.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the Republicans that want to kill it say, well, parents are spending it on other stuff, vice goods and, whatever they want, and not on the kids. But it turns out there is a very strong behavioral channel when you are given resources for your kids that I'm sure there's some outliers, but the average parent sort of sees that, as you say, it's not the amount, but something that you're setting aside. And then it creates kind of I think it also has kind of almost a hope effect, right? It gives you some aspiration. So I think, yeah, and that's kind of why the emotional side of it all matters. It isn't just the policy matters and the resources matter, but without kind of, if people have absolutely no emotional response, then
Yeah, I
It's
think you
really
answered
good
the question. I
question.
was just going to say, in Canada, there's a program that will provide $2,000 for a low-income child, and on an economics perspective, that's so little compared to the cost of higher education that there's a skepticism that it can make a difference. But I was just struck that when you bring in the language of your research, the mechanism starts to become more clear.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And Luke Schaefer,
Yeah.
he and Mona Hatish Hanna, who's a pediatrician in Michigan, at Michigan State, have an amazing program. They have a huge grant for it, where every child born in Flint gets $1,000. Again, when you think of it in the big picture, that's not that much. For a very poor family, that's huge. And part of it is the Hope Channel, right? It's like somebody's trying to help you get ahead. It is the extra resources that matter, but not solely. And they're actually including my hope metrics in their evaluation to see if it makes the mothers more hopeful, because we do know, we have some other work I've done with some PhD students on things like maternal depression and both younger children's outcomes and then on teen outcomes. And, if the mother is depressed, it's, the kids' outcomes suffer. So, anyway.
Amazing. Musa, the last question.
Thank you. Thanks for the insightful talk. My question is also looking for entry point to engineer hope. And I wonder if you could comment how this research relate to the locus of control literature. So the way you define hope appeared to me as if to be hopeful, you almost necessarily need to have some degree of internal locus of control. And if you could comment.
Yeah,
on that.
that's a great question. And in fact, in the Peru surveys, I think in the Missouri surveys too, we included a couple of measures. We actually measured internal locus of control. And in a recent study we've done with a huge panel data set in Australia, that article's sitting at demography and may never emerge, but we hope so. But in any event, locus of control is very correlated with hope. And we can't really establish a causal mechanism with the data we have, but I think they're very closely related, because internal locus of control is like, I can do something right about my life, versus external is like, it's all happened to me, I can't do anything about it. And that's very much a part of hope. So it's a great question. I think they're very much correlated.
Yeah,
I
control.
wish I could tell you what the
ability
cause
to
of-
predict the future
Yeah.
6 months from now, even if you're thinking you can, right?
Right.
Even if you actually can't. So
Right.
all of these things are so important.
Yeah.
This has been a wonderful talk. I think, I personally am walking away going, like Canadians think a lot about Americans, and I come from the U.S., and I sometimes, I think I know what's going on in the U.S., and then I hear that youth, that the U curve is broken for youth, and I go,
Really-
oh my God. Now I'm starting to understand the Trump phenomenon a little better. I know those areas have been hit by massive deindustrialization, unemployment. There's also that sense of perception of falling behind relative to sort of other groups in the cities doing better. Certainly we have spaces of despair in Canada too, and I think that there's a correlation and link to the places that are where we see high rates of opioid overdoses and all of these kind of early
Yeah, I've read a bit
mortality.
about
It's
it,
all
yeah.
very, very linked. And so, one of the books that your talk reminded me of was called "Ain't No Making It" by Jay McLeod, which we read in in our public policy sociology class. And I remember Justin Wolfers, the economist, said it was the best sociology book he ever read.
Oh,
Because they
really?
follow a group of black youth and white youth in Boston over a period of a couple decades, and it's amazing because the black youth are much more hopeful than the white youth, and part of it is because of civil rights and a sense of optimism that things are changing for the better or will change for the better, whereas the white youth see deindustrialization, they see their parents and their brothers doing poorly and just can't.
And
they
no,
have- they
and
lose
nobody,
hope.
and nobody is saying you can do better.
Yeah.
It's just kind of, you
Yeah.
think that's.
I mean, the
pretty
sad
good.
part is the outcomes for both groups are pretty bad on that one, but racism plays a big part of
Yeah,
explaining that
definitely.
difference. But I think that your work has really pointed to the importance of us being way more systematic about measuring hope and despair, and in terms of understanding, we know inequality is bad, we know poverty is bad, we know that, social capital is important, but this is a kind of, they're all interlinked, but I
Yeah.
think we need
And
to
I,
better
yeah, and I think
measures.
that the behavioral response to policy incentives is
Yes.
kind of, we don't talk about that much, but it really matters.
Yes. So I hope we could talk about that more. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. Please join me in giving Professor Grimm a big round of applause. Now I'm very pleased to open the next part of our evening's agenda, which is the reception. There's a bar and snacks out in the lobby, as well as student research posters presenting social policy research completed by master's and doctoral students from the Munk School and across the University of Toronto, which I hope you'll get a chance to check out either this evening or tomorrow during a break or lunch. I was so excited to have so many students involved in this program, in this institute, in part because, it's the young people whose energy, creativity, and potential provide me so much hope. At least I feel so privileged to work with so many amazing young people, and therefore all the more tragic, I think, to hear about these trends in the U.S. and certain communities. So I hope you get a chance tonight to reconnect with some old friends and colleagues, as well as network and meet new people as well. Just to let you know, the closest washrooms are down the stairs, 2 flights of stairs. After the reception winds down this evening, we'll reconvene early tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., where there'll be a casual continental breakfast, and our first session will start early at 8:30 a.m. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening.